Hello, this is Anna Dimichik Law Firm, and speaking with me today is Howard Cohn, my colleague. He has over 45 years of legal experience, both in criminal defense and civil litigation. Hi, Howard.
Hi.
Thank you for talking to me today. And I wanted to discuss specifically domestic violence in California. Can you share your experience?
I can. Domestic violence is a very hot topic in California right now. And the way it is treated in the courts, many people are getting a very bad shake when it comes to an outcome in domestic violence where what they think is going to happen doesn't happen. And it's a little similar to the way drunk driving used to be 30 years ago. When I first practiced, actually 40 years ago, drunk driving was a problem. Mothers Against Drunk Driving got to be a very big organization, and they lobbied very heavy against drunk drivers for increased punishments. And it got very popular to be on the bandwagon of everybody's against drunk drivers. Similarly, everybody's on the bandwagon now of domestic abuse, and we have to protect the victims of domestic abuse. And so what's happened in the drunk driving cases, it used to be that you were presumed drunk if you had a blood alcohol level of a 0.15. Mm-hmm. So when I started, it was a 0.15. Then they lowered it to a 0.125. Then they lowered it to a 0.10. Then they lowered it to a 0.08. Now that is the blood alcohol where they're saying that it is presumed you're under the influence. Well, alcohol hasn't changed, and the difference between a 0.08 and a 0.15 is almost half.
Right.
So the idea of saying someone is now under the influence of alcohol with a 0.08 is legislative. It is not practical. It's the way that the society, that the government is putting a punishment and making it more difficult to defend against drunk driving. And so they just say if you have a 0.08 blood alcohol, you're under the influence. And they make it very hard to defend to yourself. Now, domestic violence has gotten to be a very hot topic also, especially since the O.J. Simpson case. For a lot of you younger people, O.J. Simpson was a very famous running back with the University of Southern California and then the Buffalo Bills. He was a Heisman Trophy winner and became, after he finished his National Football League career, became an actor and was a very popular person, was on TV commercials, and everybody loved O.J. Simpson. Well, O.J. Simpson beat his wife, and beat his wife several times. And then eventually he killed his wife. And it got to be what they called the trial of the century. And he was a black man, and his wife was a white blonde lady. And so it got to be blacks against the whites. And it brought everything with regard to domestic violence in the forefront, where it became a hot topic for everybody. And so since then, domestic violence has been a very hot topic, and the courts have been treating it more and more seriously. So that's kind of the culture that we're coming from. Now, in order to convict people of domestic violence, first, the police have to get called on a domestic violence case. Well, what happens is, especially in the Asian community, people get into an argument, and one of the couple calls the police, because in the Asian community in China, the police come out and they help mediate disputes. Because when you have these arguments, people are mad. They're angry at their spouse, and they want the police to get there to show I'm serious and I want some kind of apology. Well, right. The police in California are not mediators. They have no intention of mediating. What they do is they're going to arrest somebody. And you say, well, I don't want, the victim usually says, well, I don't want my spouse arrested. They don't care. And there's a reason why they don't care. The police get blamed a lot if they go out on a domestic violence case, they don't make an arrest, and then later on something happens to the alleged victim. Society, the family goes, look, this person came and asked for help, and you didn't do anything. You didn't remove this other bad person, and now my son or my daughter is dead or is badly hurt. You're to blame, police. And frankly, the police are tired of getting blamed. And so they don't like the lawsuits. It costs them millions of dollars in settlements. And so they've come to the policy decision that if they get called out on a domestic violence case, they're going to make a determination on who they think the aggressor was, the initial aggressor. And that's the person they're going to arrest and take to jail.
Right, as a de-escalation, essentially.
And that way, they're not going to get blamed. It may cause you a problem, but at least nobody can blame them for anything bad that happens because they feel they did their job. They've separated you two, and the best way to separate people is to do an arrest. So they arrest, and then they'll write out a police report, and it's up to the district attorney's office to make a decision on whether they charge or not. It's interesting, about 20% of the time, the person that calls the police to ask for help ends up being the person that gets arrested. Because when the police make the determination, maybe it's the wife, and the police determined that in the argument she bit the husband in the hand or something, and there's a mark on the husband, they're going to arrest her even though she's the one that called the police. Then what ends up happening? Usually the spouse ends up having to bail the other partner out. The bails for misdemeanors are usually $20,000 or $30,000, which means if you pay 10% bail, it's $2,000 to $3,000 to get the person out of jail. If there's any kind of serious mark on the person, it's a $50,000 bail. And so now it's going to cost you $5,000 to get out.
Right.
Well, for these kind of crimes, although the end-up punishment isn't so bad compared to other crimes, the bail's very high. And originally, the courts had good intentions on having the bail high. They wanted the bail high so people wouldn't pay the bail. They would wait until the court date, which would be 1 or 2 days later. They would get released on their own recognizance, but at least it separated the people for 24, 48 hours. And that gave everybody a chance to cool off. Well, now nobody wants to spend even 1 day in jail. And so they go ahead, and if it's a $50,000 bail, they post the $5,000. And for many families, that's a lot of money. That money's gone. You spend the $5,000, yeah, you're going to get out of jail that day instead of getting out probably for free the next day. But people don't want to spend that one night in jail, so they pay the $5,000, and that hurts the family.
Yeah, but these nights in jail, they also come with the costs, right? So the courts may have been well-intentioned, but ultimately people are missing out on work, for example. And so this one night in jail, maybe somebody would think no big deal, but if you're missing a day or two from work, you might get laid off. So these are trade-offs, right?
Absolutely. So now what happens is the victim goes to the police and says, I don't want him to be prosecuted. The victim gets a lawyer or goes to the court. I don't want my spouse or my significant other prosecuted. The courts don't care. Right. Because it's not one spouse against the other spouse. That's not the way the court system works. It's the people of the state of California against the defendant, the aggressor. And the other partner is the victim. And that's just the way they treat you. They treat you as a victim. You're not against the other person. You're just the victim. And if the victim doesn't want to prosecute, the way the court system is set up, the district attorney almost universally prosecutes anyway. According to the District Attorneys Association, 75% of the victims recant their testimony. Right. Which means 75% of the victims say, I no longer want to prosecute. He never really hit me, or she never really hit me. It was all a mistake. I don't want to cooperate. And so they're used to that. and they go ahead and prosecute anyway. It gets worse. Again, the courts do this with the best of intentions to begin with, but at the end, it doesn't work out the best way, and I'll explain why. When you go to court, the court, as a policy, issues a criminal protective order, which is usually what is known as a stay-away order and a no-contact order. So now, not only is your spouse or other partner getting prosecuted, they have to move out and they can have no contact with you. And if you have kids, that's usually no contact with the kids also until the case is resolved. The district attorney's office, as a policy, always requests the no contact criminal protective order. And you have to argue with the judge on why to please not do that. The reason why these criminal protective orders were originally enacted was because the courts were afraid that the other spouse, if they were together and could talk to each other, would have undue influence on the victim to say, don't prosecute, lie, change your testimony, or maybe there's going to be some violence. And so because of the prosecution going on, and so they think it's in the best interest of society for the people to be separated so that can't happen. Sounds like a good intention, but in practice, that's not the reason. The reason why the district attorney's office, in my belief, does it is because if the families get separated like that, there's a better chance that the defendant will roll over and plead guilty just to get the restraining order resolved so they can get back to the family. So it's an extra pressure that the district attorney, an extra hammer that the district attorney has over the defendant to get the defendant to plead to something that otherwise he may not plead to. So it may have been set up with a really good intention, but in a practical sense, I don't believe that it gets done that way. It's just it's done for a ulterior motive, an ulterior purpose, and that is for the DA to get a much easier chance to have the defendant plead guilty. So in our society, it's interesting. When I first started, drunk drivings were the main criminal case that we got. And I would get 2 to 3 drunk driving cases a week. Now, 45 years later, I rarely get a drunk driving case. I get
not that
2
many.
to 3 domestic violence cases a week.
Right.
Now, I work for an Asian law firm. Most of our clients are Chinese, but it happens disproportionately to the Chinese community. And it's not that the Chinese community is more violent than the rest of society. In my belief, the Chinese community as a culture is much less violent. It's just that they're not used to our system of justice here, and they call the police too quickly when it really wasn't necessary. If there's a fight and there's some violence going on, sure, if you're in danger of your life and you have no other choice to call the police, by all means, call the police. But usually the best thing to do is get out of Dodge. Just leave the house. Give the thing a chance to cool off. The police should be not your first resort, but should be one of your last resort. They're there if you need them, but they're not there as your friend.
Right.
And I just think culturally, and I've been to China many times, it's different in China. In China, the police don't arrest unless it's really, really important and really, really serious.
Unless there are injuries. Unless there are already injuries, they're going to avoid arresting. Yeah, and not just in China, but in several other countries as well.
Yeah, and frankly, that's because it's a communist country. You can't sue the police so easily in China like you can sue the police here in California. Lawsuits in California, it's very easy for someone to file a lawsuit against somebody else, and the judgments can be very large. And the police are doing these arrests to cover their own rear ends and to make sure that they're not going to be the ones that get blamed. Well, in China, the police aren't worried about getting blamed, so they can do what is really right. Where here, the police aren't necessarily doing what's right, but they're doing what's best for them from a safety standpoint.
It's defensive on their side, essentially.
Yes.
Right. And another way I see this kind of arrests coming around is by neighbors calling the police. So I've seen a number of cases in my practice when it's not one of the people who are fighting, not one of the partners in the couple calling the cops, but rather it's the neighbors calling the police officers. And that's when I see people making the mistake of telling the police everything that happened when the police arrives.
That happens a lot. Again, the police come out to try to keep the peace, and if there is truly a danger, they're there to help with the danger. But when they start asking you questions, they're not your friend. They're usually trying to ask questions to arrest somebody.
Get you in trouble.
So cooperating with the police is very rarely a good idea when you're a potential suspect.
Right.
It's better to, if at all possible, leave the scene. If you think the police are going to come, just leave and give things time to calm down. Come see a lawyer, tell us what happened. We'll decide what's necessary to do. If you're a victim and you don't know what to do, you come talk to us. If we think a restraining order is necessary, we can always file a civil restraining order. If we think it's necessary that the police do need to be involved, we can help you call the police and cooperate with the police. Another thing with immigrant type communities is when I grew up, everybody that I grew up with was a U.S. citizen. Well, in the Chinese community, many of the people are on H-1Bs or student visas or green card, or they're here on an asylum. And there's a lot of different things other than being U.S. citizens here. Domestic violence can put your green card and your ability to stay in the United States at risk.
Absolutely.
So that is a big problem. Also, some people marry people for green cards and get to people for green cards. And another way for a spouse or to get a green card is to allege domestic violence and then go under there's an act, it's a prevention act, a violence protection act, that if you're a victim of a violent act, you can get a green card.
Violence Against Women Act,
yes. People have to be very careful. And that's why my usual advice is, if you're having an argument with your significant other, stop, leave. Be the one that leaves. And usually that's going to avoid the problem. And if you don't know what to do afterwards, then come see a lawyer and we can advise you, get a restraining order against this person. Go to the police against this person. Go get counseling. We'll figure out counseling for you. There's a lot of different avenues to do, but it's never a good idea to do it in the midst of an argument unless you really feel, you're
threatened, truly threatened,
in danger.
Right. Howard, let me ask you this question. So what is the lowest amount of physical contact in California that would qualify as a crime that could potentially get someone arrested?
Well, sometimes, certainly anything that leaves a mark, you're going to get arrested. But it doesn't have to leave a mark. It can just be the threat of the violence, and they can arrest you for it. So many times, and here's another problem. When someone calls the police, and this is just human nature, they want to justify that they called the police for a good reason. Once they call the police, people, just as human nature, tend to embellish on what happened to them. They say that something worse happened to them than that it really did because they don't want to make themselves foolish for calling the police for a little thing. And so if it was a little push, they might say, he pushed me really hard. If it was a harder push, he knocked me down. If he put his hands on you, he grabbed my neck. It's human nature to tell the police, especially if you're the one that called, that something worse happened, to justify why you called the police.
Right. And usually the worst thing that a person, a potential defendant can do is to admit to something they did not necessarily do to appease the person making the accusation, because I've seen that dynamic playing out as well. It's when somebody thinks, oh, I'm going to agree to this, I'm going to admit it, and this is going to just make the problem go away because my significant other is going to be happier. But this is precisely the wrong thing to do in the context of accusations of domestic violence.
I agree. It almost never makes it go away. When the police question you, the first thing they'll do is they'll separate you. You don't know what your other significant other is telling the police, and they'll ask you what happened. The moment you start telling them, they're just using that as evidence to either arrest the other person or to arrest you. Mm-hmm. And this is how you don't have to say anything. So you say nothing. And if the other side says enough to get you arrested, well, they do. You're going to probably get arrested anyway, but at least you didn't admit anything, and you always have a chance to do your defense later. Your defense is, well, they made me do it, or I did it in self-defense. They don't care about the self-defense. They care about I did it in. The moment you said I did it, now you admitted that you did it, they can take you to jail. And so I just cannot say more strongly, don't say anything.
Right.
If you have to say anything, say I'd like to speak to an attorney.
Right, because our Constitution allows people to not incriminate themselves, and it cannot be held against them. So it's perfectly fine to say nothing, to admit to nothing.
Yes, and police, like sometimes you'll put a threat on a cell phone, or you'll the police will ask for your computer, they'll ask for your cell phone, they say, give me your passcode. And people are afraid it's the police, so they give them the passcode. You just say no. And they may get really mad at you that you said no, but that's okay. No, and there's nothing they can do about it. If they're going to arrest you, they're going to arrest you. Well, they're going to arrest you anyway. And so just don't talk to the police.
Exactly. Right. Thank you, Howard. Thank you so much for sharing your experience.
Okay, great to see you.
Great to see you.